Okay, welcome everyone to today's University of Texas Energy Symposium, sponsored by the Energy Institute. I'm Gary King, Research Scientist and Assistant Director at the Energy Institute. Before I introduce more formally Tim Dixon, our speaker for today, I'll point out the upcoming talks. So next week we'll have a talk on fusion from someone here in our physics department at the University of Texas at Austin, Swadesh Mitter Majan. And the week after that will be Hydrogen Day, October 8th, so 1.008, if you want to hit that for an atomic number. So we'll have a talk on hydrogen, which will be part of our Hydrogen Day here on campus by Frank Wolak, who's the president, CEO of Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Energy Association. But today, it's a pleasure to highlight and invite Tim Dixon. Tim Dixon is the director and general manager of the IEAGHG program, our International Energy Agency greenhouse gas emissions program. And so as part of that, he is focused on carbon capture and storage, and he's responsible for the IEAGHG delivering the evidence base on carbon capture and storage to members and wider stakeholders, and for international knowledge sharing through the largest CCS conference, which is called the Greenhouse Gas Technologies Conference, and numerous workshops. He has extensive experience representing carbon capture and storage in the UNFCCC and other international agreements since 2004. So this is the time to ask about the global state of affairs of carbon capture and storage. Today is your day. We have a man to ask. He's also an Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the University of Texas at Austin, which makes me realize that we can issue something called the Honorary Fellow. Senior Research Fellow at UT Austin, so the first that actually I've heard of, so congratulations, Tim. He's been active in the UNFCCC meeting since 1999. He's been representing carbon capture and storage since 2005. He was part of the European Union's lead negotiator on getting the CCS adopted in the UNFCCC into the Clean Development Mechanism in COP17. We have Captain Romanek, she was partly involved in that, and UT Austin people as part of the Gulf Coast Carbon Center. Tim's educational background is in applied BS in applied physics and an MBA. He's a fellow of the Energy Institute UK, not the Energy Institute here, and a member of the Institute of Physics and UK Law, Environmental Law Association. So the abstract for his talk, he's going to give us an overview of CCS technology and its use to mitigate CO2 emissions at large scale, because the need for this is clear and climate modeling used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and International Energy Agency, especially for the hard-to-abate industrial sources. However, its deployment is behind what is needed, and its interaction with climate policies is complex. So he'll provide a summary and updates on how CCS plays a role in climate mitigation and what its state of affairs are. So with that said, let's introduce our speaker today, Mr. Tim Dixon. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Carrie, for that introduction and for the invite to speak here today. I looked at the other talks you've had, and you get a fantastic range of talks in the energy sector from some great experts. And I saw that last week you had a talk on CO2 capture. But who was here for that? Put your hands up. So I don't need to talk about capture, but are you, the rest of you who didn't put your hands up, are you familiar with what carbon capture and storage is? You are, put your hands up. Okay. Well, I'll talk a little bit about what it is as well. But what I thought I'd talk about today is, as the abstract says, in the global treaties that protect our planet, primarily the Climate Change Treaty, the UNFCCC, but also the world's oceans, the London Convention. I'll talk about those, and because there's been developments recently for carbon capture and storage within those. And I've got a subtitle here about transnational CCS value chains. And that's because there's a lot of interest growing in moving CO2 across international borders for the purpose of geological storage. I've been asked to talk on that aspect about 4 times in the last couple of months in meetings in Indonesia and Oman and elsewhere. So that's the sub-theme, and I'll try to talk for about 45 minutes and then take questions at the end. happy to take any questions. So I should start by just putting in our usual disclaimer that we're not the International Energy Agency. We were set up by them, but we're not them. So anything I say doesn't count as their views. But what we are is a separate research organisation established in 1991, funded by 38 member countries and organisations, and we fund research into carbon capture and storage. We produce lots of reports, we run international expert networks on different aspects of carbon capture and storage, and the reason I'm here in person today is because we had one of those workshops last week in Port Arthur on offshore CCS, where we worked with the Gulf Carbon Centre at the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin. That was our 7th workshop in that series. And people are interested in storing CO2 in geological formations offshore. We've got the Norwegians doing it, and others want to follow and learn from them. We had 60 people in person from 7 different countries there, and over 100 people online. So it was very convenient for me to continue my visit here to fit this talking today. And as Carrie said, we also organised the largest conference in CCS on carbon capture storage, the GHGT series. If you're researching or active or interested in CCS, I do recommend coming along to that conference in Calgary in October. And we run some other conferences and things as well. But a very important thing we do, along with yourselves here, is encouraging the next generation of experts. And we run international CCS summer schools. And we've run 17 of these now. We have over 750 alumni. The last one was 2 months ago in Darwin in Australia. And we have in a room here, we'll give awards to the 2 most outstanding students. I'm really sorry to embarrass you, but we have, please stand up. So that's what my organisation does. And with all that work, research, all those reports, we also try and work hard to make sure they're used in the relevant regulatory and policy environments. So I'll talk about the UNFCCC, I'll talk about the London Convention, but also IPCC, ISO, etc. We're active in making them work be used as evidence base in those. So for those who didn't put their hands up, this is a quick 101 on what CCS is. It's basically capturing carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas that we produce as humankind, causing global warming. For the large point sources that are producing this, we can capture the CO2 from those, and instead of it being emitted into the atmosphere, we inject it deep beneath the ground. So these point sources, the worst one is coal power stations, but gas power stations, anything burning a fossil fuel or processing natural gas when it's taken out of the ground. Cement plants are interesting because that's part of the chemical process of making cement. Whereas with generating electricity, you've got other alternatives, low carbon alternatives like wind, solar, and nuclear. Cement production aren't low carbon alternatives. And cement plant actually produce about 7% of the world's CO2. That's more than double aviation's contribution. So it's very important for that industry. But we can also capture CO2 directly from the atmosphere through direct air capture. Also with biomass, because that just takes CO2 from the atmosphere, and when you use it for energy, that's a short cycle, carbon cycle, and it's regarded as carbon neutral. But if you fit carbon capture on that, you've basically got a system of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's carbon negative as well as the direct air capture. So that's CCS 101. And one thing wrong with this cartoon that I borrowed from my Australian colleagues is the scale of the injection. And this is the scale for a real project from Canada. That's a coal power station on top, capturing CO2 at Boundary Dam, and they're injecting that CO2 nearly 2 miles deep. We injected at least half a mile deep because we want the higher pressure down there to keep it into a dense phase and keep it down there. And the other good thing about using geological storage of CO2 is that the longer it's down there, the more secure it becomes in the different cupping mechanisms that happen within the geology. And that's that schematic from the IPCC. So that's what it is. Why are we doing it? well, we're stopping the CO2 from being emitted from those large point sources. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, that's the main scientific body that provides the evidence on impacts of climate change, ways to mitigate, and ways to adapt to climate change. They work in cycles, and their last cycle, the AR6 cycle, produced its reports. And in the mitigation pathways to limit warming, which is the political aim is to limit it to 1.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century, or 2 degrees. They have different mitigation pathways, but they all include quite a lot of CCS and also some direct air capture, because even if you get the emissions down to zero, there's some human activities that still produce CO2 emissions, farming and other means of transport, and you've got to compensate for those with the direct air capture and biomass with CCS routes. So in their last report, they also said, if we're really going to reduce emissions enough to limit warming to 1.5, the geological storage capacity on the planet is more than enough that we need to achieve that. But there's a really big but. We need more policy instruments because we're not doing CCS fast enough. We're not doing all of the low carbon tech fast enough, but including CCS. So my colleagues in the International Energy Agency, they produce their nice reports, nice wedge diagrams, and I think they summarize it nicely why we're trying to do CCS. Those 4 bullet points there. It tackles emissions from existing energy assets. You could bolt it on to your flue stack and retrofit it. So you don't have to dismantle your energy system. You can bolt it on afterwards. You can tackle the hard-to-abate sectors like cement, I mentioned, also iron and steel, and potentially aviation through the production of synthetic aviation fuel. You can produce low-carbon hydrogen. Some people call that blue hydrogen. And that's a lower cost route to get your hydrogen economy working. And I think you've got a talk on that coming up in October. And also, as I mentioned, you can take CO2 from the atmosphere directly. So my colleagues at the IEA produced this roadmap for the energy sector in 2021. They produced this in time for the Climate Change Conference in Glasgow to show how the energy sector can get to net zero by 2050. And it's doing all the things: energy efficiency, wind, solar, nuclear, and CCS. And within that, the scaling up of all of those is immense. For CCS, it's a scale up of 100 times what we're doing now by 2035. So it's a really big scale up needed. Now that's their roadmap. 2 years later, they updated that roadmap. And we're just not building CCS projects fast enough. The good news in the top right figure there, that's the pipeline of projects under development. And you can see there's a big uptick after 2020. So we're far more projects being developed, CCS projects. But the bad news is, in the detail in the bottom right figure there, even if all of those projects are realised, that's still only a third of what is needed by 2030 to keep us on the pathway to net zero 2050 in the energy sector. So we need to be doing more of CCS projects. And for that reason, the US administration launched this initiative at COP28 in Dubai, the Carbon Management Challenge. And this is to encourage countries to scale up their CCS and carbon dioxide removal, CDR, engineered carbon dioxide removal through DACs or BECCS, scale that up to reach a gigaton scale of capture and storage of CO2 by 2030, which is not far away. But what's significant about this international initiative that was launched at COP28 in Dubai is the number of countries. That's 20 countries signed up, supported, and the lead countries are not just the ones you would expect, like the US, the UK and Canada, but also Indonesia and Brazil, two significant developing countries. So they're going to report back on this at the next COP in Baku. And today, this New York Climate Week is underway in New York, and there are events today specifically focusing on developments and progress with the Carbon Management Challenge. So that takes us to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, the overarching treaty that's trying to protect our planet from global warming and climate change. We had the Kyoto Protocol aspect of that up to 2020. That's where developed countries took on targets. Developing countries did not take on targets, but they have a clean development mechanism to encourage low carbon projects. A big breakthrough or milestone, the CCS, was getting that accepted in the clean development mechanism in 2011. And I was directly involved in that as a negotiator. And our role in general is providing information to this, working with colleagues at Bureau of Economic Geology from UT and others providing information there. But we're now, the Kyoto Protocols of the past, we're now under the Paris Agreement. And that works where every country, developed and developing, take on their own targets. They choose for themselves what they want to have as their emission reduction targets. And they put them into something called the Nationally Determined Contributions, NDCs. And these are going to be updated every 5 years by every country. And it's basically a transparent process. Every country's NDC is open to assessment and scrutiny by all the other countries. So it's like a peer review pressure process. But also, those are looking at the moment to 2030. There's also a mechanism called the long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, which are looking at mid-century to 2050. And those make countries look beyond the political horizons that they may be in, depending upon their form of government. And the political targets, limiting warming to well below 2 degrees C, pursuing limiting it to 1.5 degrees C, and reaching net zero, and it's now translated to by 2050. Net zero of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. A quick update on these. Yes, most countries, there's 197 countries in the UNFCCC, but then 195 have submitted these and updated them, but only 25 have got CCS in, 23 directly, 2 implicitly. So you might think that's not as many as you would hope, but these are just looking to things you would be putting into practice by 2030. But what is more heartening is that these long-term strategies, so 73 of these have been submitted, and 49 of these have CCS in. And as I said, the countries are realizing that putting their easy-to-do mitigation activities into the NDCs, they've got to go beyond those to get to net zero. So most of those have CCS in, and those that don't, generally countries that don't have large point sources of CO2. So to bring us up to date, the last COP28 in Dubai was really significant because it was the first global stocktake of progress against the Paris Agreement targets. Building upon taking in the evidence from the IPCC reports. And as you might expect, we're really not on the pathways to limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees even. So the overarching outcome text from COP28 was given this name, the UAE consensus, because of where it was located. And so it notes with concern there's an implementation gap, that the emissions trajectories are not in line with the Paris Agreement. If we've got a certain amount of carbon budget we're allowed to emit and stop warming at 1.5 degrees, we've already used up 4/5 of that carbon budget in our emissions. So emphasising that the world needs deep and rapid emissions reductions of 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035 to get to net zero by 2050. So, noting those concerns, the UAE consensus has various initiatives within it, tripling renewables, doubling energy efficiency, accelerating the phase down of unabated coal power. That means unabated means without carbon capture on it. And for the first time, it's named fossil fuels, transitioning from fossil fuels in energy systems, so as to react to net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. So that's the first time in a global climate agreement, fossil fuels has been named and shamed. And also, for the first time, mentioning CCS explicitly. Got the U in there, utilisation as well. but it says, accelerating zero and low emission technologies, including renewables, nuclear, and abatement and removal technologies, such as CCS, particularly in hard-to-abate sectors, which is cement, iron and steel, and others like that. So that's a significant outcome, setting the policy direction, and that was agreed by all the 197 countries, including the big emitters from that region. Saudi Arabia agreed to this. That's significant because their economy, like the UAE's economy, depends massively upon producing oil and gas. So the other aspect of the UNFCCC I should mention, from the Paris Agreement, is this thing called Article 6. So it's part of the Paris Agreement, and it's to do with international cooperation. And this is important because this is creating the international framework for carbon markets. And there's two mechanisms within this. Article 6.2 is for trading between countries, and 6.4 is a new project-based mechanism like a clean development mechanism. So this is good. This is going to create an international carbon market, so countries can invest in other countries, get reward for those carbon credits. They can use those against their own targets in their nationally determined contributions. The good thing from our perspective, these mechanisms are technology neutral, so that's good. There's no bias against CCS, because CCS, I'll come to this shortly, there is some unpopularity about it, that some environmental NGOs don't like it because of its association with decarbonising fossil fuels. So in the Article 6.4 mechanism, they were specifically requested to develop a methodology on removals. That's removing CO2 from the atmosphere through engineered routes, through direct air capture, BECCS, but also through nature-based solution routes such as forestry, reforestation. And so after quite a lot of work and put a lot of pressure back against the engineered removals, they came up with a methodology quite sound, basically generating carbon credits from these activities, protect the environment, but also if there's reversal, if there's leakage from either your forest burning down or from geological storage of CO2, then there's a mechanism to replace those carbon credits. So that's the carbon accounting integrity is protected. Unfortunately, given all the hard work that went into this methodology, it wasn't agreed at the highest level, at the plenary level, at the end of the COP in Dubai, which is a real shame. And I don't understand fully the reasons why it wasn't accepted. So if you're a carbon markets interested person, the Article 6.2 is operationalised because it depends upon countries just agreeing with each other through bilateral agreements. But Article 6.4 is not operationalised yet. There's more work to be done, and the meetings of the committee that runs that are continued, and they're going to go to the next COP, COP29 in Baku, and try and get agreement on this to create the framework for international carbon markets. So these are the compliance carbon markets, the sort of regulated carbon markets. There's a separate market called the voluntary carbon markets, which is self-regulated. That's proceeding. You can generate credits, you can sell them to companies to use, basically private sector run and led, but you don't have the governance and the regulations in place to ensure the environmental integrity necessarily of those carbon credits generated. So this is here all to do with the compliance carbon markets, as it's called, the regulated carbon markets. So given that bit of uncertainty, we do have the basic building blocks for carbon accounting, carbon capture and storage. And that's thanks to the IPCC, and they produce these guidelines for greenhouse gas inventories. So these cover all of greenhouse gases from all aspects of human activity. And every country reports their greenhouse gas inventories following these guidelines. And in 2006, they produced a CO2 storage specific chapter based upon this methodology of injecting, measuring and modelling, and if there's any leakage, detect it and measure it and report it. And that supports zero leakage assumption. That methodology actually forms a basis for most CO2 geological storage regulations that have since followed. So the basic building blocks are there, and they covered the international movement of CO2 as well. if you capture in one country, transport it to another, and store it there, who's responsible for reporting the emissions of that? Country B from the storage site. If your storage site leaks in another country, it's your responsibility. If you've injected it to report those emissions. And there's two more scenarios as well. So there is this cross-border CCS operation in place, as well as the building blocks of carbon accounting, the CO2 geological storage. So I'll put some pictures in. I've shown you a lot of words so far, which are quite, can be a bit boring. But the COPs are a very dynamic environment. A lot of different opinions are shared. Climate change is a really, the most important issue that we face. And there's a lot of activity at COPs to try and encourage countries to go further with their pledges of many themes. And in the UNFCCC environment, as well as every country having a seat at the table, civil society, as it's called, is allowed to speak as well. And civil society groups are put into different groups of constituencies. So we have environmental NGOs, we have business NGOs, we have youth NGOs, we have farming NGOs, trade union NGOs, indigenous peoples, etc. So there's a lot of activity, and there can be some protests at the COPs. They are strongly discouraged from protesting inside that disrupts the negotiations, because the negotiations are the most important thing. We need to have success in those. But here's just some pictures to show you. The bottom left one is, what's the number now? 100,000 people at the COP in Glasgow, through the streets of Glasgow. The one on the top right is interesting, because that's the Fossil of the Day award. So every day in a COP, COPs go for 2 weeks, every day the environmental NGOs decide which countries are doing the worst in the negotiations, and they give an award every day, and they get the media there, and they start with the theme tune from Jurassic Park that they all sing along to, and they put it in the Climate Action Network's newsletter, to name and shame countries. And as you go through the COPs, you can see the leaderboard. I can't remember which COP that was from, maybe Glasgow again. And Australia's up there, UK's up there for some reason, Norway, Japan. Saudi Arabia is often at the top of the leaderboard as well. So it's an interesting activity that's allowed to happen within the COPs. And sometimes it does work on some countries because they don't like to be named and shamed in such a way. But at the last COP, we had a lot of misinformation. And this is just interesting from a personal perspective. We've got a new logo and template for our IEAGHG material, and some of the fonts we've been given are slightly strange, and the title of this slide is not visible on this mechanism, but the title of this slide should say Misinformation on CCS at COP28. And that because it was hosted by a fossil energy country, the UAE, and the presidency of the COP was actually CEO of ADNOC, the oil company for UAE, there was even more lobbying and concern about CCS being associated with fossil fuels, that it's a distraction. You can see the headlines there from Reuters, from the Guardian. The Climate Action Network even produced a rap to do with the Carbon Management Challenge. Quite good, it rhymes quite nicely actually. It's just a shame it's meant to be sarcastic. And interestingly, on the Guardian article, that they counted up, there was 475 carbon capture lobbyists attending COP. I guess I was one of those. We're not lobbying, we're providing impartial information at the COPs. But if you look at the role of CCS in mitigating climate change, and there was 80,000 people at that COP, then 475 isn't enough. We should have had 10 times that number to represent the role of CCS in mitigation. Anyway, it's a very dynamic environment. It's a really important environment because the negotiators have got to make progress on CCS, on climate change agreements. Sorry. So one of the ways they take evidence-based in is to have events at the COP called side events. And working with Catherine Romanak at the University of Texas, we've applied, and there's oversubscription for these, but we've been successful for 10 years now, 10 COPs, getting an official side event, and it's turned out to be the only one on CCS. And we just heard last week that the same for COP29 in Baku. We've got our side event, and we're the only side event on CCS, and about 200 or 300 side events. Very important. We've got Brad Crabtree, Assistant Secretary of Energy here, giving a welcoming talk to this one. But they're really important because countries come along and say, can we do CCS in our country? That's my favourite question. And so we know how to help them understand whether they've got the right geology for storage, whether they've got the point sources, how they get the regulations in place, etc., etc. And the other aspect, and in the climate change world, this concept of South-South cooperation, sharing between developing countries, the global north, they like to develop expertise and experiences and mitigation means themselves. And so we encourage that as well, encourage that sharing. So last year we had a second event on CCS in small island states, sharing learnings from South Africa, which isn't a small island state, but sharing the way they did their CCS storage atlas with the Trinidad and Tobago, who are progressing, and then sharing them with Guyana, a nearby country that's classed as a small island state, and sharing on again with Timor-Leste, small island state in the Southeast Pacific. So we provide information in, this is what we do at the COPs, and also this engagement, from my perspective, especially important with the youth NGOs. They're very influenced by environmental NGOs. Some environmental NGOs like CCS, but most are cautious and some really don't like it. And so this is photos of myself at a youth event, and a roundtable event. Catherine at another youth event, where she had a microphone, our booth there, where we get lots of people coming in. And when you try to explain to people what CCS is, I mentioned to you the depth of geological storage, at least half a mile deep, or 800 meters deep. It actually helped because in Dubai, they have the world's tallest building, which is the Burj Khalifa. You can see in that photograph, that tall pointy thing. That's 800 meters high, half a mile high. So we had a model of that and just said, how deep we put the CO2? It's at least that deep. And that helps people understand geological storage of CO2. So it's very important to keep feeding information into this environment. I'm going to come on to the second international treaty shortly, but there's a link through. But firstly, I don't know if the presenter last week showed you some projects. It's not just a concept, we do actually have some projects operating at large scale in CCS. On the left, we have the Sleipner project. It's in the North Sea, Norwegian North Sea, separating CO2 from natural gas being produced and re-injecting that. That's good. Good experience, 20 million tonnes injected now. The central one is that Canadian power station where they're capturing it from one of the units. That's been operating since 2014, it's a Boundary Dam. And the one on the right is a refinery in Alberta, Canada, where they've been capturing since 2015, about 1 million tonnes a year in injecting that. And I think there are about 8 or 9 million tonnes injected into the ground now from those. So we do have enough operational projects. This is borrowed from my colleagues at the Global CCS Institute. We've got 43 operational projects now, enough to prove the technologies work. We're just finishing building 2 on cement plants at the moment. And we have a lot more under construction and under development. Within these, though, if you look at the distribution, obviously not every country in the world is doing this. And some countries are realizing they don't have the right geology or the right economy that they want to do CO2 geological storage in their own territories. So in these projects you can see on this map, 2 of them are significant because they're transboundary projects. This is what's generating a lot of interest as countries think about making trade and business out of moving CO2 around with CO2 geological storage. So the first one of these in the CCS world, this is famous, the Northern Lights project in Norway. It's offshore storage, and they're going to receive CO2 by ship from industrial sources of CO2 around Northern Europe. And they've got 2 contracts in place already. They've got 7 MOUs in place, but 2 firm contracts from the Netherlands and from Denmark. And Denmark is from a bioenergy plant, so that's going to be a BECCS project. And this is an enabling project because CO2 sources that didn't feel they had the economy of scale to develop their own storage sites. Instead, could pay the Norwegians to take their CO2 by ship, store it offshore off Norway. The really important project that's going to become the two first ships have been constructed, launched, and they're going to start receiving CO2 early next year, maybe late this year. So the second project is in Southeast Asia, in Timor-Leste. Now this is interesting because small island state, they've only been in existence since 2002, the new country, their main economy was driven by one gas field that they had producing natural gas. That's depleted. It's going to run out of gas later this year or early next year. They export that by direct pipeline to Australia, to Darwin. That goes to an LNG facility that we visited a couple of months ago. But the plan is, from the LNG facilities in Darwin, they can take natural gas from other sources to make the LNG that they then export around the world. They can capture the CO2 from that LNG production and use the same pipeline back to the same gas field in Timor-Leste and store the CO2. And Timor-Leste are very interested in this because as their income from the gas exports dries up, they can charge for taking the CO2 and storing it. So the energy companies are interested, the economics look good, and it's a small island state wanting to do this. But because this is such a good idea, the World Bank are putting money in at this, at the capacity building, of the skills and expertise needed in Timor-Leste. So I move on to the second treaty that I want to cover, and this is one that protects the world's ocean. Originally, it was about protecting them from the dumping of industrial waste. It's the London Convention and the London Protocol. Two names because the London Protocol is the newer version of the convention. It's got 87 countries in the original version, and it bans dumping of plastic things in the world's oceans. It allows some things to be dumped, but they've got to have a permit from a regulator that ensures the protection of the marine environment. The lawyers, though, didn't put a definition on the depth of seabed that comes into scope. So in theory, it goes all the way to the centre of the Earth. So geological storage offshore fell under this and was prohibited. So in 2006, realising that this was not an intention of the London Protocol, they amended them itself to allow CO2 geological storage. And that came into force in 2007. But they also produced a new set of guidelines for ensuring that regulators issue permits that ensure the protection of the marine environment. These CO2 specific guidelines. So that's good. But there's a but, because not every country is a party to the London Protocol, they didn't want countries exporting to non-London Protocol countries so they could dump it in their seas, whatever ways. So there's an export prohibition. So in 2009, the Norwegians said, that's not sensible either. We want to be able to take CO2. Let's have an amendment and only allow export of CO2 for geological storage. So that was approved, that was good. But because of the legal makeup of that of the London Protocol, to come into force, it needs to be ratified by 2/3 of all the countries. And over 10 years, only 10 countries ratified, and that was not enough. So it didn't come into force, so you still could not export CO2 for geological storage. So in 2019, they decided to apply a legal instrument called a provisional application of that amendment for export. A big debate, lots of discussion, but it was approved at the London Convention meeting in 2019. So that's good. You can export CO2 now for storage. You've still got to follow the original amendment requirements. You've got to have a bilateral agreement in place for who's responsible for what aspects of the permitting. And also in the second to last bullet point there, if you're exporting to a country that's not a party to the London Protocol, the exporting country's got to demonstrate that that receiving country has got the same level of regulation in place as if they were in the London Protocol. That's really important. So that's in place, you can export CO2. And I just showed that picture there because it's a UN-based meeting as well. So that's the back of my head. What you can't quite see there is sat to my right-hand side is Greenpeace. They're very active. And unlike the UNFCCC, where NGOs can do protests and things, but they don't sit at the negotiation tables. In the London Protocol, they do. So it's important there because Greenpeace are not as enthusiastic about CCS as I am, as we are. So they do express concerns and try and put spoilers in there a bit over the years. But we work with them. We work with them in a very constructive way. So that detail for the export side, with new guidance produced on the agreements and arrangements, is quite buried in the London Protocol meetings. If you wanted to do it yourselves, we produced a report for the London Protocol Secretariat to draw out these requirements of the guidelines and projects. And that's just it. And in terms of an update, this has enabled that Norwegian project to go ahead. The Norwegian government said green light 2 months after that 2019 agreement. Declarations of provisional application have now been submitted to the Secretariat by Norway, Netherlands, Denmark, Korea, Belgium, Sweden, UK, Switzerland. The first agreement or arrangements that need to be, these bilateral agreements or arrangements, the first one was Denmark and Belgium. There's since been this year Denmark and France, the Netherlands, Norway, these bilateral agreements as well. And some countries are realizing that the Timor-Leste way of thinking, there's a business to be made by taking other countries' CO2. Trinidad and Tobago for the Caribbean region, Indonesia for Southeast Asia, in competition potentially with Timor-Leste. But those countries are not parties to the London Protocol. So any country that's going to export to them has got to demonstrate that they're going to meet the requirements of the London Protocol in terms of regulation and protection of the marine environment. So there we have Timor-Leste working with Australia. So the Australian government has got to prove that Timor-Leste have got the regulations in place to protect the marine environment. We'll back money going in, helping them develop those regulations. We're yet to see how that's going to be demonstrated by the Australian government. It'll be precedent setting, but there's going to be more of this. All the countries decide to become parties of the London Protocol. So I'm sort of wrapping up now. Those bilateral agreements, people were stressing out about those. You're not meant to read this text. This is just to show you how little needs to be in them. This is between Belgium and Denmark, and it just basically says which authority in which country regulates which bits, issues permits for which parts of the CCS value chain. That's not difficult between two London Protocol countries. So the last slide I've got is just a very update for this spring's meeting of the London Protocol and its scientific group. They have a working group looking at permitting experiences. That's good. How are countries getting on issuing permits for CO2 storage? Greenpeace continue to express concerns about CCS, whether they can only use it for hard-to-abate sectors and not for the power sector. But this is the marine treaty, not an energy sector treaty. So there's pushback against doing that. We're the only CCS organisation in the room. We're there helping with providing the evidence base. And the work continues and experiences continue and countries develop experience and confidence in doing offshore geological storage. That's carbon capture and storage in two large international treaties and updates on those. I used the word complex in the abstract at the beginning. If you think CCS is complex in this environment, marine geoengineering is far more complex, and because of the uncertainties about how effective it is, people are looking at ocean fertilization, regulating plankton growth to take up CO2 from the atmosphere through iron, putting iron in the oceans, or even taking carbon out of the oceans. We've got ocean acidification happening. There's no national boundaries. We have currents and tides. Really, a lot more complex. So there is a moratorium on marine geoengineering under the London Protocol, except for research purposes. So if you want a career in a really complex area that's growing, and the legal side is very complex as well, and US Department of Energy are putting working funds into this area, but this is, a very exciting, active area going forwards. CCS, we just need to get it done. That's the bottom line. Now we know how to do it, we just need to get it done. So just some references at the end. You've got the slides afterwards. The second from last one, that Anglia one, that's Southeast Asia, carbon markets, carbon flows, CO2 flows across countries, carbon crediting, all of those requirements for that hot topic of transboundary international CCS value chains in the Southeast Pacific. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, start with one online, but raise your hand while I was answering, so I point to you in the room if you have a question. Online, here's a question. How do you view the role of the WTO, World Trade Organization, accelerating adoption of CCS? Do they have any role? We've already talked about other frameworks or.
I don't have an answer to that clearly, but the carbon markets are the interface with carbon capture, storage, and world trade. So I don't know how the World Trade Organization itself gets engaged in the world's carbon markets, but the UNFCCC is the one that creates the compliance carbon market frameworks, at least. So world trade, yep, there's going to be trade in CO2. Really good question, and it's going to make me look at what the World Trade Organization does to see if it's on their radar yet.
Right. That's with our audience. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim, for the presentation. My name is Tim. I'm from Indonesia. So yeah, right now I'm planning to do my research in saline aquifer of carbon containment. So my question is more like technical. Do we have to keep exploring saline aquifer for the storage, or maybe we can just keep doing in a depleted oil and gas field? Because yeah, saline aquifer is really promising, but as you know that the exploration, especially in Indonesia, is still in a really preliminary stage. So it's really hard to explore in Indonesia. On the other hand, we have so many depleted oil and gas fields that we can use. So what do you think? Should we keep exploring, or should we just use the depleted?
So it's both. And just for everybody else's benefit, using depleted fields means using depleted oil and gas reservoirs. That's the benefits of using those to put CO2 back in, like the concept of putting the carbon back where it came from. But you've also got an understanding of the geology, because you've been producing all gas from there. And also you know that the cap rock above has retained those fluids and gases for geological timescales, which is what we want for CO2. And there's likely to be infrastructure that could be reused as well. The downside with reusing depleted oil and gas reservoirs is you've got holes in the cap rock from the wells where you produced oil and gas. You don't know what state the infrastructure is, and whether it's suitable for CO2. And also, there's just the amount that is available is not large enough for the amount of CO2 that we need to store. Deep saline formations are similar geological formations, just without oil and gas in them. And there's far more of those around the world. So it's just a scale issue. That yes, we can start using depleted oil and gas fields. Certainly there's benefits with that. But to scale up, straight storage in deep saline formations is going to be needed. And so those projects we showed on the map, there's a mixture of geological storage there. Some are using depleted fields, some are straight storage. So it's both. And Indonesia's got quite a lot of depleting oil and gas fields to start with, at least. Yeah.
Tim, thank you very much for your great presentation. I'm being myself petroleum engineer, have to ask engineering related question. And technology-wise, how do you see the interrelation between the petroleum engineering and the CCS?
So that's an interesting question, because from a starting point, you think that the geological expertise would be similar, but actually one is to do with extraction of fluids and gases, and the other one is to do with injections of fluids and gases. And the geology behaves in different ways as to whether you're extracting or injecting. And so the core skills are there, but there's certainly a degree of retraining strongly suggested for petroleum engineers to convert over, but it's very relevant to their expertise. not that they've got to go back into a degree again. And the Bureau of Economic Geology here at UT does run commercial courses for retraining petroleum engineers into being CO2 storage engineers. So that's a very successful program that they've got, that they're doing online courses even this week. Your Catherine's colleagues are doing ones that have got people all around the world online doing that. So it's related, but there is a difference, are differences.
All right, can I ask a question from online next? So it's our economics question. So comment on the economics of CCS. Recently, Equinor and Shell canceled major blue hydrogen projects. There are perceivably not enough takers for the CO2 or blue hydrogen yet. And I'm going to add on to that. How do people talk about at the high level conferences about whether CCS is a profitable opportunity or it's just a cost of waste management? So, I mean, I guess there's a company that wants to handle waste for them to profit with society. It might be a cost. So how do people talk about that and any comments on economics of CCS?
Yeah. So I don't know the two projects on blue hydrogen that they're being referred to, probably project specific, because the ones I know of are going forwards. But it is a waste management issue. It's a cost. It's not like wind and solar where you get an economic benefit coming out of electricity from those technologies. CCS is a cost. And so, and it's an externality on the environment. This issue, economic issue of externalities. You've got to cost them and charge the economic activity for the impact it has. And in this case, climate change, CO2. So that's how it's generally regarded. But then under that context, that drives down CO2 emissions across all sectors in many different ways. Once you've got that incentive in place, then the business models can come in and start rewarding companies. In the US, you have a tax credit called 45Q, gives $45 a ton of CO2 straight storage, and that's stimulated maybe 90 projects now in the US at different stages of development. So that's giving an incentive to a policy instrument, but no, companies won't do it on their own. There need to be the policy incentives in place. And you can have carrots, like a carbon, a lot of this tax credit here, or in Europe, we've got the emissions trading scheme, which is a capital trade scheme, or you can have sticks, like the Brazilian CCS project, offshore CO2 storage. Petrobras, the energy company, were told you can't get a permit to develop that deep offshore gas field unless you capture the CO2 you're producing at the same time. The same in Western Australia, the Gorgon project led by Chevron. If you want to expand your LNG facility, you've got to capture the CO2 from that and store it. Otherwise, you don't get a license to operate. So both policy instruments are relevant, and that's how it's regarded.
Very good.
Yeah, thanks again for the representation, Abraham, from the Petroleum Engineering Department. I'm also doing my research on the CO2 storage in heated gas reservoirs. And during the summer, I did my internship with Chevron on a Biography project, one of the biggest initiatives for CCS in the US. Actually, have one question. Like recently, I came across a report that says that in the US, we are injecting about 1.9 million standard cubic feet of CO2 daily per day for the purpose of enhancing gas recovery, enhanced oil recovery applications. But unfortunately, about 90% of this amount is coming from natural CO2 resources and natural CO2 reservoirs. And the reason apparently for this is the cost of the CO2 coming from natural resources is much cheaper for enhanced oil recovery applications than capturing the CO2 from like either a point source or from atmosphere. So do you think, so apparently the need for CO2 is there to inject it in depleted gas reservoir or depleted oil reservoirs. But do you think we need more investments in the capture side than the storage technology? And how can we accelerate this? And what are your insights about that?
Yeah, so historically that's correct. In the US, which is sort of world leading in enhanced oil recovery using CO2, they've got the CO2 from natural sources. But that experience is not wasted because we've got a lot of knowledge developed hopefully BEG working on projects like this. It is CO2 storage. Some of the CO2 stays in the subsurface. So when the oil company was buying CO2, are buying CO2 to inject for that, it's annoying for them because half of it stays down there. And then to find some more to replace it. That's because those trapping mechanisms are so good and CO2 is very sticky in the geology. But going forward, it's about stopping man-made CO2 emissions. And so the 45Q tax credit also gives some credit, I can't remember the amount, $55 a tonne, $35 a tonne for CO2 that's used for enhanced oil recovery, acknowledging that some of it still gets trapped in the subsurface, but it's got to be man-made CO2, man-produced CO2, which anthropogenic sources on that. So it's important, and it's recognised in the policy instruments now that we've got to stop taking the CO2 from the natural sources and focus on, and that's what is happening. And the infrastructure has been put in place in Canada and Alberta. The Alberta Carbon Front Line is a giant front line of CO2 pipeline, so industries can connect into that. Here in the US, you already have one, the Green Line, that goes from the what's this? Mississippi. Goes to the Mississippi area, where the CO2 source, natural CO2 source is, to oil fields that wanted that CO2 here in Texas. And now they're putting in sidetracks into that to link in man-made CO2 sources, the industrial sources of CO2 into that pipeline. And we visited that last Thursday, actually, with our international group and workshop to see that. And there's plans for more pipelines to connect up more industrial sources of CO2 into such sources, into such transport pipelines, and then not just use it for enhanced oil recovery, but use it for straight storage. And there's, as I said, about 90 projects now, the past 6 permits in application for straight storage in the US. So we're going to see the straight storage use expand rapidly over the enhanced oil recovery.
All right, ask a couple more online because these are fairly good questions. I guess I'll go with the leak question first. Inject CO2 at the scales you're talking about, such as offshore reservoirs, and realize that there are minor leaks from the reservoir during or after the injection. How do you deal with this? Is there a risk of acidification of the ocean for tiny leaks, or somehow you just stop it at the source and inject it? But anyway, so general question about leaks and how to deal with this, or
so
sure they don't happen.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And it's a question that we've been asking for 20 years, doing lots of research on. So first of all, you start with good geological characterization of the storage reservoir and the cracking rocks above it. So you've got confidence in the geology. So you choose sites that don't have leakage pathways through engineered routes, such as old abandoned wells or faults or fractures that may be leakage pathways. So that's required in the regulations. You characterize and you demonstrate to the regulator. Here it's the EPA. In Europe, it's the European Commission. You demonstrate that you don't have leakage pathways. In the projects we've got so far, none of them have leaked. And to test what we do if there is a leak, we've had to engineer leaks. There have been various research projects where they deliberately injected CO2 in a way that would make it come into the environment. Famous one in Montana. The Albertans are doing one at the moment that we're going to visit at the GHGT conference. And we've also done it offshore and to test the monitoring techniques. Basically, because you want to be able to detect leakage if it does occur, and then you've got to, if you detect it, you've got to quantify it. You've got to be sure, first of all, that it's your CO2 that's leaking. So we have various techniques that distinguish it from the natural CO2 from the injected CO2. And if it is yours, you've got to quantify it. You've probably got some economic reward, carbon tax credits or carbon credits for doing that. But also in the marine environment, we've done the modeling on leakage scenarios. And in the worst case scenario, and obviously it's going to be, the worst case scenarios are generally around wells. And wells are engineered structures that you can re-enter and close off. You know, the petroleum industry knows how to do that. It's been doing that for decades. But in the worst case scenario modelled in the North Sea, the marine scientists, to see the impact on the ocean chemistry, they had to remove the impact of the CO2 in the atmosphere on the oceans first. Because the amount of CO2 we put in the atmosphere, that's turning the oceans acidic. They had to remove that to see a theoretical leap from the Cycle project. So it's something we need to be aware of, we're confident of the monitoring, but we also know the scale of the impact is not so great. And the marine environment in the controlled releases has a very transient impact as well. It's localized in area, and once you turn off your CO2, within 30 days, it's all back to normal at that location. So we've got great science on that, great research papers produced, so we have a lot of confidence in that.
All right, one more, which could be short, it's maybe similar to the World Trade Organization question. Various countries introducing carbon border adjustment mechanisms that have a positive or negative impact on this carbon trade and import and exporting, or has that been determined, how to think about carbon border adjustment, CO2 trade?
So it's a new area, obviously. And the CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, is a European policy, because the Europeans have got quite a tight emission policy, cap and trade scheme that reduces the allowances, that ratchets down the emissions allowed from industrial sources. But to protect their industry from imports of products that may not have such emissions reduction policies in place, they're introducing this carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM. So any product coming in, like steel, has to have the same carbon footprint in its manufacturing as if it was made in Europe. There's a whole range of products that this is being applied to. It's in its test phase at the moment. Kicks in properly, I think, next year, 2026. And obviously, one of the aspects will be, if CO2 trade is going on, is the CO2 being stored in geological formations that meet the same requirements as if they were under the European CCS directive for geological storage. So that's the theory yet to be tested, but it's really interesting because it is a very level, it creates a level playing field for one of the biggest economic areas in the world, the European Union, and the imports coming in. And we're hearing countries who rely upon exporting to the EU, they're worried about this because they're going to have to decarbonize their products. That's actually a good thing. That's what we need. So we were in Trinidad and Tobago early this month with the Prime Minister, and he very enthusiastic on CCS, but very concerned about CBAM on the exports of ammonia for fertilizer production to Europe. I'm sorry, but that's the world we're in. We've all got to reduce emissions, and this is a way that's very fair across countries. And in their case, Trinidad and Tobago, they've got great geology, they've got great CO2 sources of pure CO2 with low cost capture. They're going to be in a better place than many of their competitor countries, in my opinion. So that's my quick one. 101 on CBAM.
All right, this is a person who's been diligent and asked this question twice, so I'll ask it. This is the last one. What's your take on the U, if you will, out of CCUS utilization? How do you view the capture of CO2 to make commodity chemicals like methanol as opposed to just storage?
So
Scale
the carbon accounting is much harder, and the durability of that removal of the CO2 from the atmosphere is crucial. The geological storage is storing it for geological timescales. That's what we need, CO2 out of the atmosphere for more than 1,000 years. A lot of these products, when they're used, they re-release the CO2. So they're not really keeping CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's so many different utilization routes. Some are more permanent, CO2 in concrete and cement, for example. Wood products can last for a long time. So in Europe, they're working towards a carbon removal crediting mechanism. And that's distinguishing between the permanent removal through geological storage and the removal through products, which is complicated, and they really don't have all the methodologies in place. And the second point, Carrie, you mentioned, yes, the scale of the CO2 we've got to keep from the atmosphere is massive, and there's just not enough utilization options to use that CO2, to use it up in any way. So we do need to have the straight storage. So
Okay.
that's the answer to that.
Thank you very much. So it's in right there, Tim Dixon, program.